Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Julia Rothkopf, and I am the Program Associate at YIVO. Today we have Anna Elena Torres and Amelia Glazer joining us to discuss Dr. Torres' book, Horizons Blossom, Borders Vanish, Anarchism and Yiddish Literature. For those of you who do not know YIVO, we are a very special place for celebration, contemplation, and exploration of Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture. We are located in New York City, where our library and archive contain over 24 million documents and 400,000 books. And these resources are used by researchers from all around the world. We also have lots of classes on Yiddish language and culture, exhibitions, and public programs just like this one, where we aim to bridge the worlds of Jewish culture and our vast library and archival collections. And I would also like to thank the Tammament Library at NYU and the Labor and Working Class History Association for co-sponsoring today's talk. So thank you all for joining us. We are very excited to have you all. To give a brief introduction for our wonderful panelist, Anna Elena Torres is an assistant professor of comparative literature at the University of Chicago. She has edited With Freedom in Our Ears, Histories of Jewish Anarchism, published by University of Illinois Press in 2022. And Amelia Glazer is professor of Russian and comparative literature at UC San Diego. Her research and teaching interests include Russian literature and film, transnational Jewish literature, literatures of Ukraine, the literature of immigration to the US, the Russian critical tradition, and translation theory and practice. She is currently writing about poetry in contemporary Ukraine. And now I will hand it over to Anna and Amelia.
Thank you so much for having us. And this was just such a pleasure to get to read this book. And I actually got to read it with you at a very early stage. So it's just wonderful to be holding it in my hand. It's a beautiful object. It's a really, really fantastic book. It's a book about writers who reject the confines of state borders. Instead, the writers that you talk about, Anna, advocate in both their content and their form for a dissolution of borders, for mutual aid, and for care, and often for revolution. And it's also a book that offers anarchism as a category to Yiddish literature, both to make us think about the influence of the movement on Yiddish writers, but it also suggests in various ways that Yiddish itself shared some intimacy with the ethos of anarchism. And I wonder if you could start by reading a little bit from your book, by opening up with a sense of how you frame this project.
Great, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be in conversation with you, and thank you, YIVO, for hosting. So yes, my aspiration for the book is to show both the historical encounters between Yiddish literature, materially in terms of the Yiddish anarchist press, right, which was a mass movement. It had dozens of newspapers. It was publishing avant-garde poetry, expressionist, anarchist poetry. So there were very material connections between the anarchist movement, its valuation of free speech, which allowed avant-garde literature to be published, to uncover and document both the material and historical connections between Yiddish anarchism and the mass radical labor movement, and also to go a step further and think about how to read with an anarchist lens. Now that we have traced the historical moments in which anarchism and literary history were in conversation, how could we then read with an anarchist lens as well? What would become more illuminated if we were to think about anarchism as a mode of reading as well as a mode of organizing? So those were my aspirations for the book. And although much of the book focuses on modernist poetry, particularly of the 1920s, I'm also interested in anarchist poetry of the 1890s, and I'm also interested in poetry written in a period after, in the 1930s and later, when it was thought that anarchist movements had already dwindled or been erased. So modernism is at the core, but it's also the before and the after. And so to give you an example of this approach of highlighting both the historical connection and also anarchism as a mode of reading, I thought I would speak for a couple minutes and read some poetry by Peretz Markish. Markish was a poet from Ukraine, from Poland, and he became known particularly for his communist verse. And he was seen, he was a member of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. And in addition to this, not necessarily in spite, but in addition to this, he also had, I argued, profound historical connections with anarchism. One of these is that if we look at one of his early manifestos for Khaliastra, he identifies it as an anarchist federation. So using his own language to describe avant-garde poetry as an anarchist federation. He was also in Ekaterinoslav, the same time as Machno. His family had contact actually with Machno, who, according to his wife's memoir, saved the life of his father-in-law. So there are all of these historical connections, both that he was saying in his manifestos as well. He was very interested in anarchist aesthetics. So the book looks at some of his manifestos and his early work, and he documents this historical resonance. But then I'm also interested in reading some of his work with an anarchist lens, meaning thinking about revolutionary temporality, thinking about a vision of border-free territories, thinking about a kind of hyper-present moment as opposed to a life deferred after the revolution. So an anarchist temporality as well. And Markish wrote a book titled Der 40-jährige Mann, The Man of 40. And it was begun in the 1920s. He continued working on it throughout his life. And a few hours before he was arrested under Stalin's command, this manuscript was hidden in a sack and it was smuggled out. And the Yiddish version was only published in 1978, I believe, in Tel Aviv. But before the Yiddish version was published, there was a Russian translation which sought to recuperate Markish. So I'm going to read from my translation of Markish's Yiddish text, 40-jähriger Mann, which is a poema of about 80 pages. And this is poem 33 from part 1. Markish writes in my translation, "Daybreak drips like a golden salve upon mountain peaks and forest peaks. With quivery wind and bright rustle, dawn dozes, stirs, and wakes up. A swallow tries to soar on tiny wings. Dawn's blacksmith thunder peals rouse the woods. Waving, a winging, a twittering strikes. The forest fills with joy, replenished by song. Any minute now, the world streams over its border, anointing with shine, with golden drink. Reach out a hand, just tug at the mouth of the bare body of bare skin, and the forest lifts itself up, high and fast, and with hands lifts the dawn and with shovels the day. And I am here too, I'm also fated to be upon earth at joy of daybreak." So this is one part of a very long poema by Markish. And I think when we read this poema with attunement to the anarchist image, and anarchist aesthetic and sensibility, lines such as "Otot gießt sich schon über die Welt bis in Rand," any minute now the world overflows its border. This sense of any moment now already. It's not a postmodernist always already, but it's a kind of modernist explosive moment of being hyper present. And then there's also the kind of almost seditious Jewish image of Salbung, thinking about anointing or consecrating. So there's something transgressive here for a poet in embracing the sacred as well, especially in this context. And then finally, the daybreak that Markish describes it's this moment of possibility. And in the Russian translation, the line about a golden salve, Salbung, it's translated instead into a red flowing dawn. And that red is not there initially, but the image of a red dawn is coded in a different way, in a different aesthetic. So yes, when we read it, I think with an anarchist lens, something else might emerge in terms of how space and time an anarchist diasporic approach to space and time might become more illuminated.
Thank you so much, Anna. I love this. I love this piece, and I love the image of spilling over the borders, right? Which you can see also that this makes its way into the very title of the book. The kind of the new day blossoming, images that sometimes a more simplistic reading might simply scan as leftism, as communism, and you're reading into that also this aesthetic of anarchism, which is much more fluid. I wonder if you could say more. You've talked about reading with an anarchist lens, and I wonder if you can say a little bit more about this lens of anarchism. We have books that approach the modernist moment broadly defined, let's say from Whitman all the way through World War II, that look at the modernist moment from a variety of angles, as you know, a movement that comes from the margins, the rejection of religion and tradition, communist internationalism, immigration, masculinity, technology, things like trains. You choose anarchism. And this is an impulse, of course, that celebrates statelessness, that celebrates mutual aid. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how understanding this anarchist ethos helps us to understand Yiddish and also modernism better.
Sure, thank you. So first of all, in terms of modernism and anarchism, there were real material ways in which the publication of experimental literature was supported by anarchists. Margaret Anderson, for example, who was the editor of Little Review, who published James Joyce and other modernist writers. She was based in Chicago. She adored Emma Goldman. And there was a period of time in which the Little Review was seen as essentially an anarchist magazine. And I've gone through the archives and looked at the letters of donations and could see from the addresses some of the ways in which anarchist comrades were supporting, were involved with seemingly purely literary newspapers, such as the Little Review. And actually, if you go to the Fine Arts Building in downtown Chicago, you can still see the door with the gold lettering for Margaret Anderson's office. So in terms of anarchism and modernism, there was a way in which the anarchists were willing to throw down. They were willing to fight for free speech. They were willing to fight against the post office and the seizure of these newspapers. So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is thinking about their critiques of hierarchy and then what it meant for them to give primacy to the figure of the artist and also to the figure of the refugee. And I can read a bit of my definition of anarchism as I see somebody has just asked me to do so. So this is how I define it. Anarchism is a prefigurative ethics of anti-authoritarianism. As Emma Goldman declares, it envisions the undoing of power and the restructuring of social relation toward comradely attachments. Anarchism's constellation of aspirations includes the dissolution of national borders, the cessation of war and militarism, and abolition of prisons and police forces. Rather than prescribing a single platform or policy blueprint, anarchism critiques hierarchy itself as a structure. Anarchist praxis consists of artistic freedom, mutual aid, and direct action. As Ruth Kinna writes, quote, "The anarchist's colossal ambition is to combat domination." Anarchism furthermore critiques the framework of human rights as dependent on state protection, instead seeking the fulfillment of human needs regardless of citizenship. As Agamben notes, quote, "The status of the refugee is always considered a temporary condition that should lead either to naturalization or repatriation. A permanent status of man in himself is inconceivable for the law of the nation state. Thus, anarchism challenges the model of state-granted human rights and critically centers the refugee rather than the citizen." So this is how I define anarchism overall. The form of anarchism which this book considers in depth is what I term anarchist diasporism, as opposed to the classical anarchism articulated by primarily Christian Europeans. I'm interested in how did Jewish anarchists re-signify, negotiate with some of the anti-Semitism, for example, of European anarchism. And so for me, the term anarchist diasporism is about how did they cultivate an imagination and an ethics out of statelessness, right? And it seems difficult to say, right? Because a stateless person is a person who suffers. And yet they were theorizing from their own position as refugees, their own critique of the border, rather than aspiring towards citizenship to articulate another mode.
Thank you for that, Anna. And you know, you're toggling between, in the book, you're toggling kind of between defining anarchism as a political movement, but also the various aesthetic movements that are connected to anarchism. You are also discussing an ethos of anarchism. And one of the really compelling things about the study is that you've found a way to move between these things, the politics of anarchism, which is intimately connected at various points to the politics of the Jewish left, and then also the aesthetic forms that help to further this and maybe that are inspired by the politics. You seem to end up in a place that has more to do with an ethics, our behavior towards other humans, right? There's an alternative ethos to, let's say, I don't know, a religious ethics or a communist ethics. And I wonder if you can offer a few examples of the aesthetics of anarchism as you read it in the book.
Great, thank you. So when I speak about aesthetics, I don't mean a unified style. I'm interested rather in forms such as the elegy. So the elegy is a way of taking something and taking grief, taking mourning, and refusing for it to become only an individual feeling, instead to collectivize this affect of loss. And so I have two chapters on elegy. The first one is about Haymarket. So this was the execution of a group of primarily German anarchists in Chicago, 1886. And I look at some of the elegies that were written for them by Yiddish anarchists, particularly David Edelstadt. And then I also look at the poetry written after the execution in 1927 of Sacco and Vanzetti, who are two Italian anarchists. And I'm interested in how they created a public culture of mourning. The aesthetics in terms of style are extremely different between the 1890s poetry and the 1920s, 1930s elegy. So it's quite heterogeneous. And yet through all of them, there is this kind of concern with the elegy as a form of radical mourning. In the elegies that are written for Haymarket by David Edelstadt, it's a suite of poems, a kind of poem cycle. And they would be published in the weeks leading up to November 11th, which was the anniversary of the execution. And he had a poem for each one of, they were called the Haymarket Martyrs, as well as poems about the date itself more generally. And so I argue that Edelstadt is taking Jewish modes of mourning, right? The period of 30 days after and leading up to the yahrzeit, and he's kind of re-imprinting Jewish time with this revolutionary temporality. The elegy itself, for example, for Louis Ling, who is a young German anarchist who died by suicide in his cell, and the newspapers gave very gruesome descriptions of his body after his death. But the poem by Edelstadt restores him. It's reparative. It describes the beauty of his face, and the Shekhinah is upon it, and so it's sacralizing him. This is very different from the poetry written by Markish. And Markish, in one of his manifestos, he talks about a Schauderlichkeit, the sense of shudderingness, like a kind of aesthetics of horror. And so there's a romanticism about Edelstadt, something reparative, whereas for Markish, it's more a kind of a shock, a confrontation, an expressionist scream of grief. So in terms of style, it's very different, but through both of them, there is this taking seriously horror and beauty, and this refusal to allow grief to become something private or unseen. In both of those modes, there's an aesthetic of mourning poetry.
So sometimes it's about the aesthetic of mourning, and sometimes it's about looking away and allowing mourning to exist in private. And a place that you deal with this is in your chapter on Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti was obviously a rallying case for the American left, one that became kind of in hindsight a rehearsal for other leftist events that would follow throughout the 1930s and late 20s, the crisis in Palestine in 1929. And you actually have a section where you deal with Glattstein looking back at Sacco and Vanzetti on the 2-year anniversary of their execution, which would have been August 23rd, 1929, which actually that date happened to be the very beginning of the Palestine uprising / pogroms, depending on who is describing them. So August 23rd had become this dark day of mourning. And then, of course, there's the Scottsboro case, the Laurie Mill strikes in Gastonia of North Carolina. All of these events are events that were kind of rallying causes for the Communist Party, but also for anarchists. And in the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, it was directly an event about anarchists. It was the execution of 2 Italian anarchists. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how anarchism figures into a leftist hagiography. And if you could talk a little bit more as well about the extent to which these movements were somewhat fluid. Does this matter to readers? Can a reader read from both, let's say, a communist lens and an anarchist lens simultaneously?
Great, thank you. Amelia Glazer's also written a wonderful chapter about Sacco Vanzetti poetry, which I recommend in Songs in Dark Times. So the poem that you mentioned by Glattstein was not identified as an anarchist. He wrote this quite long epic poem, and you would, the title identifies it as related to Sacco and Vanzetti, but the poem itself is really complex, and much of it is from the perspective of the governor himself. And so I'm very interested in this. He narrates the way in which the governor tries to naturalize his own power. There's a kind of refrain in which the governor is disavowing that he's in a position of power even. So it's a really fascinating poem. And so I tried to read Glattstein's Sacco Vanzetti poem with an anarchist lens, think about how is power functioning in this poem. And one thing that I emphasize is that modernism is sometimes seen as this radical break or rupture from earlier movements. There's a kind of model of successive generations going from the proletarian poets of the 1890s who are explicitly embedded in labor movements, both socialist, communist, and anarchist, the proletarian or sweatshop poets. And then it's sometimes seen that they were succeeded by De Jonge or the Insurgisten or these other movements. But reading with being kind of attuned to these questions of anarchist aesthetics while reading Glattstein, I show some of the ways that Glattstein's actually picking up themes and tropes from the anarchist poets to create a kind of genealogy that goes from Haymarket to Sacco Vanzetti. And here it's not so much about Glattstein's own avowal of politics, but about a mode of reading and what Glattstein is doing with his verbal art. So for example, there's a line which the translation is by Larry Rosenwald. Thank you for allowing me to quote it in the book. So there's a line where there are protesters outside the house and the governor is indoors and he's listening to the protest and he says, "Run me through with your golden needles of song." And I think this is such a proletarian image, right? The hand tool, all of the Morris Rosenfeld poems about the golden tuning fork. So there are these ways in which the modernists are picking up sweatshop imagery as opposed to using experimental poetry to kind of erase these earlier archives. So that's one way that we might read them in a continuity between Haymarket and Sacco Vanzetti.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, your emphasis on various anarchist genealogies is really important because you're both working helping us to understand anarchism within existing understandings of Yiddish modernist genealogies, but also helping us to see how anarchism as a form is there in various ways. I want to, yeah, please.
I didn't answer the first part of your
course.
question yet.
Yes.
Sorry. So I think another aspect about this question of collective or public mourning is that I look at the archives of correspondence between anarchists after Haymarket and after Sacco Vanzetti. And one of the things that I discuss is the very, very fervent feeling of personal connection that they had, although Sacco and Vanzetti were immigrants, and Haymarket, the Haymarket martyrs were immigrants from Germany and from Italy, and none of them were Jewish. But there was a way in which they had an affective solidarity, a sense of fellow feeling with them. One of the letters that I discuss is between Van Valkenborough and Emma Goldman on the eve of the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, and they're kind of the way that they're framing it, and they're quite grumpy about the ways in which communists have taken up Sacco and Vanzetti as a cause. And so it's quite emotional and affective, the way they're thinking about it. Some of the ways in which the story has been told is that this was a unifying moment for the left, and everybody marched together. Interestingly, much of the newsreel footage of the Sacco Vanzetti marches was destroyed because they didn't want newsreels to be showing how huge the memorials were. So there's a way in which even that was narrowed down, the sense of public feeling. And then I also found in an archive, the Labadie archive in Michigan at Ann Arbor, I found it was on paper that was just as thin as onion paper. And it had been sent from a penal colony in Russia, and the political prisoners there learned that Sacco and Vanzetti had been executed, and so they went on a hunger strike. And when you look at the date of the letter, you'll see that it was, they only found out about the executions about 9 months after it had happened. And so thinking about this kind of embodied practice of grief and ways in which there was a felt sense of solidarity transnationally. So taking seriously this sense of feeling and how it was related to literary expression in anarchist reception of Sacco Vanzetti poetry.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that in, which helps us to understand this transnational impulse that you're dealing with in various, and really all of the chapters. I want to go back to the question of aesthetics and to material culture. There were explicitly anarchist journals. There were journals that fell into the category of anarchism in various ways or became venues for anarchism. Can you talk about the publishing practices that mattered to the people that you're writing about? And can you discuss the aesthetics of these books and journals as objects as well?
Yes, certainly. So my book with Kenny and Zimmer, the edited volume with Freedom in Our Ears, talks about the dozens of anarchist newspapers that were published between 1886 and World War I. And there's a chapter by Ayelet Brin that looks at translations of coverage of the McKinsey assassination, which I also recommend her work in that volume. In terms of the aesthetics and the translation, the Yiddish anarchist press was really an engine of translation, especially Freie Arbeiterstimme. So here we'll see, this is a 1906 translation of Kropotkin, of Bread and Freedom. Here is an edition from 1900 of Freie Gesellschaft. And you can see the ways in which they tried to make everything beautiful. The type font, right? If your idea of an anarchist publication is, you know, only zines made in Kinko's in the 90s, where a DIY aesthetic is really what is emphasized, this is quite different. There was an interest in beauty as something which ennobles the working class, beauty as a right that every worker has access to, a rejection of austerity as something imposed, I think there's a particular femme aesthetic, especially in Emma Goldman's work. She often writes about flowers and buying flowers after work. She has incredible attention in her memoir and elsewhere to clothing, the way that self-presentation, self-fashioning, also in terms of gender presentation, incredible attention to that as an articulation of the self, as an ennobling of the self. Goldman is always describing dresses very carefully. She loved dancing. There's a description I found of someone watches how she starts the dancing at a party, how she would get the party started at a ball. There's also a letter I found by Alexander Berkman, Sasha Berkman, who is one of her partners and comrades. And he's describing how he wants his trousers to fit, and kind of attention to it's to his tailor. And he's kind of saying, oh, you understand how the hips have to fit so I can sling my gun in this way. And so there's all of this attention to material culture, not just as print culture, but also as self-fashioning and clothing, and the red scarves worn at the Paris Commune uprising. So by material culture, I think of it in multiple ways related to circulation of the press and also circulation of the body in public. Here's another translation. These are some pamphlets as well of French anarchist theory. And there's also, have quite a stack next to me for show and tell. Thinking also of the interest in Francisco Ferrer. So this is an edition of Freie Gesellschaft, Free Society, from 1910. And so they were circulating some of the anarchist pedagogy of the Spanish anarchist educational theorist, Francisco Ferrer. So yes, translation, aesthetics of the body, aesthetics of typography. And the last book that I'll show you is a translation of poetry, here attributed to Basil Dahl, in parentheses, Joseph Bovschewer. And so he was one of the proletarian poets, beloved of Edelstadt. This is a translation by Rose Freeman Ischel, and this is published by Oriel Press in 1928. And you can't touch it, but the typography is really exquisite, and it's such attention is given to every aspect of the book production. And I also bring it in because not all of the poets are men who I discuss. I also focus on Anna Margolin and Malka Chaifetz-Tussmann, Katerina Yevzarov-Marison, etc. I look at the publications of Lucy Parsons and other widows of Haymarket. But another way to expand the canon of anarchist writing from this period is by thinking of the women who are translators, who are doing the labor of translation, and giving attention to this as an art. What kind of translational choices did they make? How did they support this circuit of anarchist thought in traveling further through translation? So I would include Rose Ischel in this, both for the labor of making the material book, and then also thinking about the role of women as translators and editors.
I want to come back to the role of women, but I because you're talking about translation, I was really intrigued in reading the book about the relationship between the ever fluid process of translation and anarchism. And many of the ways that you describe anarchism as a practice, as an ethos, as a politics, is kind of parallel or rhymes in some way with my understanding of translation, something that you're always trying to get to. It's never done. And first of all, I love your very prominent citation of all of the translators. You're bringing out the voices of people like Aaron Kramer, of blessed memory, many of these translators in the past who were making Yiddish available to a wider public in the US. But it also strikes me that translation as something that's always in a process of becoming may be similar to Yiddish in more ways than one. First of all, Yiddish speakers were very often translators. They were very often multilingual. Yiddish is a language of translation in a sense. As Saul Zaret has recently written, it's it perhaps could even be considered Teich, a language of translation. And it's a language that bred a lot of anarchist thought. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about these utopian linguists that you deal with in the final chapter of the book. Does translation as a practice figure into the aesthetics and ethics of anarchism?
Yeah, thank you. So I am very interested in translation theory, and translation is making a text multiple. And so there's something there which also can provoke anxiety around the authority of the author, for example, right? So making a text into translation is also making it collective. So I think the anarchists were quite interested in that as well. The last few chapters deal with language politics, and we might think of how strongly associated political movements, Jewish political movements in the 20th century have been with language. So thinking of the Hebraism of Zionism as a single language, the Bundist emphasis on Yiddish itself as a language for the transnational working class of Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. These were largely emphasizing a single language ideology. And for Jewish anarchists, there was an emphasis on multiplicity. Alexander Harkavi, who wrote the dictionary, and he wrote Briefensteller, these guides for writing letters for new immigrants to the US. He was an anarchist linguist, and he writes trilingual dictionary, not one-to-one, but kind of triangulated. One of the articles that I discuss is in, I believe, Freie Gesellschaft, and it's a linguistics article about loan words. And so you might think, this would be politically neutral territory, right, to talk about loan words and language. But in fact, what he says at the end is property is theft. Right, inside of an article about how words are borrowed between languages, right? So property is theft. He's using this famous anarchist dictum. So there are ways in which their politics of language are being shaped by their anarchism. I was fortunate to interview Audrey Goodfriend, who was an anarchist editor, and she was Emma Goldman's nurse at the end of her life. And I asked her, do you think that there was an ideology of Yiddish qua Yiddish amongst the anarchists? The way that there was for the Bundists and the Zionists. And she said, I wrote in Yiddish because that was the language that I spoke best. What are you, an academic? So I think there's a sense, right, in which it is practical. At the same time, I also think that it was strategic. And the chapter which looks at language in detention centers on Ellis Island, language between those who were being deported, some of the political persecution of dissident Yiddish writers during the Red Scare. It looks at how they are strategically saying some things in Yiddish that were unsayable in English. And I do look at a number of multilingual newspapers, including Gazeta, which was a handwritten prison newspaper produced in Ellis Island, in several languages, all handwritten and circulated amongst the deportees. So there are strategic ways in which they were using a minor language. There are ways particularly in which they used Yiddish to disseminate information about reproductive health and birth control during the Comstock laws, for which Emma Goldman was also charged. Goldman spoke in Yiddish very prolifically about sex and about reproductive health. And so there were ways in which they were using Yiddish to negotiate surveillance and detention. I also write about some of the utopian linguists, A.O., who this was a constructed language that tried to be mathematically perfect to communicate with the cosmos. There's also an idea that one way to eliminate racism and sexism would be to have no markers of race or sex in language. And to eliminate private property, there should be no possessive case as well. So ideas of changing society by changing language. And then there's also a section in the book about Kropotkin and translations of Kropotkin into Yiddish. And he has an extra 7 pages about how important it is to translate into the little languages. So as opposed to thinking of Esperanto as a universal second language, it's not moving towards a horizon of universality with no difference. That's not the model of cultural liberation. It's through the protection of all of the little languages. It's through difference, including through linguistic difference, that liberation would be achieved, not by the erasure, not by establishing a new universal language.
I want to go back to the question of gender, because this comes up really talking about Grace Paley, who brings gender into her own poetics in very pointed political ways. What does it mean to include gender as something that's almost prescriptive in a study of poetics? And Paley writes about, the necessity to be female for both men and women. So if you could, perhaps talk about that, maybe bring in that passage.
Sure. So I can read, this is a poem titled Responsibility. Grace Paley identified herself as a cooperative anarchist. And I'm not sure that this was actually reflected accurately in her FBI files. I think they had identified her as a communist, but on the back of her books, she describes herself as a cooperative anarchist. So this is a poem which was published with the title Responsibility. And it actually grew out of a speech that she gave, I believe in an auditorium in a conference of poets. So the first time that it was read aloud or performed, it was in this gathering of poets. And this is the way that it begins. It is the responsibility of society to let the poet be a poet. It is the responsibility of the poet to be a woman. It is the responsibility of the poet to stand on street corners, giving out poems and beautifully written leaflets. Also leaflets you can hardly bear to look at because of the screaming rhetoric. It is the responsibility of the poet to be lazy, to hang out and prophecy. It is the responsibility of the poet not to pay war taxes. It is the responsibility of the poet to go in and out of ivory towers and two-room apartments on Avenue C and buckwheat fields and army camps. It is the responsibility of the male poet to be a woman. It is the responsibility of the female poet to be a woman. And that's about the first third of the poem Responsibility. And I see this poem really as an anarchist manifesto, thinking first of the line, it is the responsibility of society to let the poet be a poet, not it is the responsibility of the poet to support the labor movement, or is the responsibility of the poet to be a card-carrying member of a political party. No, it's the responsibility of society to let the poet be the poet. And then we have the line, it's the responsibility of the poet to stand on street corners, giving out poems and beautifully written leaflets. So first we have this idea of beauty being foregrounded, and then also leaflets you can hardly bear to look at because of the screaming rhetoric. So to me, this is so much the heterogeneity of an anarchist aesthetic, whether it's the Scheuderlichkeit, the screaming, shuddering expressionism, or the beauty, all of it, it's in the first line. And then there's an interview that I cite with Goldman, and she says, yeah, that poem gets a lot of men really mad, or at least it gets them annoyed. She says, first I say it's the responsibility of the male poet to be a woman. So people thought I would then say it's the responsibility of the woman poet to be a man. But no, it's not the responsibility of a Black person to be a white person. The oppressed have already learned a great deal about the oppressor, trying to survive within that dominance. They already know it. Yeah, so there's something here about the imagination of the experience of another, the political imagination of another's identity. And then this line, right? It's the responsibility of both the female poet. It isn't something inherent or essential. It's some kind of ethical mantle to take up. So.
Thank you. Before we move to Q&A, I wanted to ask you about the coda. I really loved this coda because you're suggesting continuity moving into the future. You include the beloved late Julia Eisenberg, a musician and artist whose work has been such an inspiration to you. and also David Schneer, a mutual friend and a colleague who collaborated with Julia, also of blessed memory. But I also love that you discussed the continuity between the Italian anti-fascist writers that centered on this circle that included Leone and Natalia Ginzburg, among others. And you leave us on this note of a possible continuity into the future, perhaps even a usefulness, an urgency of some of what you've discussed about anarchism for our own time. Can you talk more about where you see the aesthetics of Yiddish, or maybe simply Jewish anarchism moving forward?
Sure. So I had hoped to end this portion of the talk by playing so you could hear a clip of Julia Eisenberg's voice, her incredible, powerful, radiant voice. So her album, The Ginsberg Geography, I write about in depth, and she sets to music and reinterprets the work of, as you say, Natalia and Leone Ginsberg. And she's doing deep research on the archives of Italian anti-fascist music, as well as workers' songs from Italy. And she also includes the Woody Guthrie song, All You Fascists Bound to Lose. So I thought I would play that for you. But yes, for Julia Eisenberg, her work, and I think that coda brings together what I identify as these different aspects of anarchist diasporism. One is genealogy, saying that this is not a utopian movement. It's about uncovering solidarity and mutual aid as the always already, as the science of how evolution works, as the way in which people survive by living together. It's always already here. It isn't something deferred. It isn't utopian. So the genealogy work for Julia is these genealogies of music, the archival work that she does, the way that she reinvents song. I think of that, this anarchist genealogy. And then the aspect of elegy, of attention to people's individual biographies, right? A lot of anarchist historiography, it's called Anarchist Voices, Anarchist Portraits, the work of Paul Avrich. It's about the individual lives of people. So I wanted to kind of honor that historiographical approach by writing about Julia as a person, as an individual in the end. And then the anarchist aesthetics of it, you can hear for yourself. I'll play, if that's all right. Could someone remind me, so it's under share screen and then advanced computer audio?
Go directly to advanced, and it should take you to the audio option.
Right, okay.
Sort of a perfect place to maybe segue into the question and answer. I want to make sure we save time for that. I have a half an eye on the webinar chat and notice that we have some people here in this room who are intimately bound up in some of the histories that Anna has been talking about in the book. So I'll turn to some of the questions. I understand that we can go a little bit over, so we'll take some extra time as needed. I wanted to start with a question by David Fisher, who asks about the sweatshop poet David Edelstadt. How does he and other labor poets, David asks, fit in with anarchist temporality, dissolution of borders, Yiddish is inflected by anarchism? If you could say a little more about Edelstadt.
A little bit more about Edelstadt. Yes. So Edelstadt, he came to the US via London, and Goldman writes about him in her memoir as well. She refers to London as the clearinghouse, basically, so we can think about transnationalism, the importance of London as well as a kind of satellite. Faith Hillis also writes about Russian anarchists in London. So Edelstadt was part of this circuit. He comes to the US and he saw Albert Parsons giving a talk. Parsons was one of the Haymarket martyrs. And so this was part of his radicalization as well. And then he writes these elegies about Haymarket. How does he fit in with anarchist temporality? Well, you can read a bit more in the chapter because I talk about Edelstadt quite extensively. I'm interested in some of the visions of reproductive futurity that Edelstadt has, thinking of death as a door to revolution or ladder, and whatever is done to us in this present moment, there will be fighters and fighters and fighters after us. Then I have a bit of a critique of Edelstadt in terms of putting him in conversation with Malka Chaifetz Tussman, who's a Yiddish poet known for her feminist work. And in her early period, she was writing for the Chicago-based anarchist newspaper. And so I recover some of her vignettes that were published in English with a Yiddish inflection to them. And she's writing about the lives of women factory workers. And so I'm writing a bit about ideas of labor as masculinized and valorized in Edelstadt, and then thinking about women poets' responses to this kind of vision, right? So if you're talking about generations and generations of fighters, well, who's going to be raising them? What about the reproductive labor of this kind of vision of anarchist futurity? So Edelstadt is in the chapter on Haymarket, and then the Haymarket chapter ends by looking at the post-Haymarket generation of their widows who were publishers and some of the women who were writing after Haymarket. How is gender implicated in the kind of visions of labor liberation that was articulated by the Haymarket generation? But yes, and I love Edelstadt very much, and I tracked down some of his descendants, and one of the stories that one of them told me was about his sister kind of being in the house singing Edelstadt in the kitchen, and thinking about these legacies, these poetic legacies of Edelstadt. He also wrote poetry in Russian, which has not yet been translated. So there's much more to do with Edelstadt. But I'm interested in seeing him as a much more complex poet than he's sometimes cast. Sometimes Edelstadt and the other proletarian poets are discussed in the context of labor historiography rather than in the world of literature. So I am interested in taking him very seriously as a poet, not just as a propagandist.
And just a reminder to everyone, we have both a chat and a Q&A. So if there's a question that you'd like to address to Anna, please put it in the Q&A. Although you're welcome to use the chat amongst yourselves. This is clearly a room full of people who have a lot of knowledge about this and a lot of investment, which is really wonderful to see. I want to move to a question by Shlomit Ritz-Finkelstein about the category of anarchism. And this is an important clarifying question. Shlomit asks, does it conflict with non-political categories that are defined by common language, common collective memory, religion, or ideology?
So where do we set a boundary around anarchism as opposed to other modes? So this is a question that I think with a lot in the chapter on feminist genealogies, because some of the women, including Katerina Yevzarov-Marison, and also including Rosa Lebensboim, who wrote as Anna Margolin most famously, they were part of the anarchist movement, and they were also suffragists. They were also advocating for female full citizenship. And this was pre-1920 in the US, before women's suffrage, in particular white women's suffrage, those in terms of who benefited from it, who was not excluded from it. So what did it mean to be a woman anarchist who believed in the dissolution of borders and the end of private property, who also did not have a private property rights and also did not have the ability to vote, right? So this chapter is all about this tension. And I look at Katerina Yevzarov-Marison wrote a book, Freie Gesellschaft, which is a history of women's political power in essence, and she's looking to create a genealogy of matriarchal power. She's looking at ancient Greece and Rome. She's interested in Australian indigenous life. She's trying to create a genealogy, particularly about women as political subjects. And the whole book is quite anthropological. And then the last line of this book, which I read in the reading room in the British Library, and when I got to the last line, it basically says, women read and be free. And it kind of breaks the fourth wall at the end of the book. So yes, this is not something which I think can be resolved or justified, one or the other. We know that there were women who participated in both, who were disenfranchised in both movements as well. And with the case of Yevzarov-Marison, her book was published shortly after Mutual Aid, Kropotkin's work. I look at 4 other histories of anarchism written in Yiddish by men, and they are all trying to create a genealogy of Jewish anarchism. They're trying to think, who is the first anarchist? Was it Jesus? Was it the Essenes? Was it Gideon in the Bible? Are there moments in the Talmud that are proto-anarchist? They're trying to create a genealogy, establish an authority for Jewish anarchism. And at the same time, women were trying to do this, anarchist women were trying to create a genealogy of women's power. So there's a very strong shared anarchist aesthetic to genealogy as a practice, as a mode of thought, but the stakes were really different. And so this question about where is the boundary really is negotiated by these women who are both anarchists and suffragists. Not all anarchist women, of course, were suffragists. The chapter discusses Voltairine de Cleyre and Emma Goldman's critique of suffrage, which they see as quite sexist and racist because it was making claims that women were more noble or more pure, and therefore if women could vote, it would lift the whole country. And so Goldman and others were saying, no, this is sexist. Women are no more angels than anybody else. You can't make a political claim based on this idea of gender essentialism. But yes, that chapter is kind of negotiating this idea of female citizenship with an anarchist lens. And then to your question about religion, I think there's a critique of secularism in some of the work of the Jewish anarchists. One person whom I write about, Yankov Meir Zalkind, he was a rabbi, polyglot. He translated the Talmud into Yiddish. He saw the articulation of an anarchism from within Judaism as a way of fighting anti-Semitism. And there were other anarchists who were anti-clerical and anti-religion. So in the Jewish context, it's quite heterogeneous. They also had to negotiate the anti-Semitism of classical anarchists such as Proudhon. And so that chapter looks at Yiddish translations of classical anarchist anti-Semitic texts as well. These are borders that were being negotiated from inside the movement.
I'm going to mix up the questions just a little bit to get to the more general ones first, and then we can move towards the end in case people need to leave to more specific questions. Jacob Cantor asks about the limits of Jewish anarchist geography or internationalism. Noting I read Emma Goldman's memoir and was struck by both how large her world and community was and how narrow, focusing almost exclusively on Europe, non-Ottoman Europe. Do you want to say something about those geographical limitations?
Sure. This is the question from Jacob Cantor.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, so there's a great deal of research still to be done. Focus on the Spanish Civil War tends to look at Jewish Ashkenazi fighters who went to Spain to fight in the brigades. There's been very little research on Sephardic communities during the Spanish Civil War, Balkan communities at that time, which were Jewish. This is a very open field of research. One of the things that I articulate is that there was a kind of spectrum of citizenship possibilities for Sephardim and others in the Ottoman Empire, as opposed to the experiences of deportation and dispossession that was experienced by Ashkenazim. So I'm looking particularly at Yiddish archives, which articulate a theorization of the state from particular forms of nation states. There are individual anarchists such as the painter Camille Pizarro, who's Caribbean and moved to Paris and identified as an anarchist, and he was not Ashkenazi in terms of his ethnicity, but he was living in France. There are other anarchists who are Jews who were writing in Istanbul and in Turkey. But this book is focused on the Yiddish archive, and I would be very excited to see work done on other aspects. And just in the last few years, there's been, just tremendous new scholarship. Sho Kanishi's work on Japanese anarchism in conversation with Russian anarchism. So Japanese and Russian is a beautiful model of thinking about structures of modernity, structures of translation with Japanese and Russian, thinking about transnationalism in a way that is focused on Asia. So I recommend his work as well.
A really compelling question here from Elaine Wilson, who's curious about the role of technological advancement in anarchist aesthetics. Your attention to the proletarian imagery of the hand tools and material culture is so rich. Thank you, writes Elaine. But what to make of, say, the electro head of De Cagliastra or the influence of futurism and its violent industrial imagery at this early 20th century moment? How does this factor in?
Yeah, thank you. So first, maybe I'll say something about the press. There was such an intimacy to typesetting, thinking about Kathy Ferguson's work where she discusses the itinerant anarchist typesetter. And she talks about how they would carry the tool that you rest your wrist on over their shoulder while they travel. So thinking about the bodies and the labor of typesetting. And then for the Yiddish anarchists of the group Freiheit, for example, they lived in Harlem in a collective apartment, and the press, the physical printing press was in their room, and they would print out of their bedrooms, basically, and they would distribute the newspapers at night by walking over the rooftops of East Broadway, and they would drop it into the factories below. And they were so good at it that there was a rumor in Harlem and on the Lower East Side that the anarchists owned a small plane, that they were flying over Manhattan in a small aircraft, dropping these pamphlets. They did not own an anarchist distro small craft. They were walking over the rooftops. But to your question about technology, I would emphasize the intimacy and the physical labor of actually printing and what having a household-sized press might enable them to do. And then in terms of the images, right? So I spoke a little bit about the hand tools that tailors would use. How were those images taken up? I have a whole bit about Houdini and his trick where he would swallow he'd swallow 100 needles, and then his assistant would pull out the thread from his mouth, and all of the needles were threaded. So we can think of this also as a kind of modernist magic making, the transformation of a hand tool, the transcendence of labor into magic in some way. So aesthetically and materially, they were playing with these tools. And then the image of the electro head. So this is very uncanny because in the Haliastra Manifesto by Marques, he has this image of an electro head. And there is an image of the electro head in the title page of Verzigergerman. And this illustration is by Lev Serkin, Soviet and then Israeli artist. So you can see that there's it looks like a decapitated head with these, the wires, right? And so I always thought that Lev Serkin had made this illustration because he had read the manifesto of Haliastra. I was fortunate to have interviewed the children of the artist Serkin, and it turns out that Serkin and Marques did not meet. And Serkin actually made these images without having read Marques. There's some kind of visionary symbiosis of their imaginations. They both had the image of an electro head in their respective work. And it was not, it was just kismet. It's such a specific image, and they both arrived at this image of the electro head with wires coming out. So yes, even in this moment that you'd think would be about technology, there's something rather mystical about their mirrored aesthetics. Yeah, it's completely uncanny. The illustrations are not illustrations in the book. These were chosen images from Serkin's work that he made independently, and they appear to basically illustrate Verzigergerman. So I'm incredibly thankful to the descendants who, Eva Belavsky in particular, who showed me over Zoom her father's annotated copy and the notes that he made in the margins, but he only read Marques after he drew these. So.
I wanted to jump back to a question by Aaron White, who has done some translating of anarchist poetry. And Aaron asks about the tensions between anarchist aesthetics and the advocacy of violence, noticing that, there tend to be a few categories of anarchist poetry: the elegy, which you've discussed here today, hope, right? This mutual aid together with hope, and then also violence, a focus on vengeance, a focus on perhaps class. Can you talk a little bit about how perhaps mutual aid reconciles itself with violence?
Yeah, sorry, what is the name of
Aaron White.
Aaron White. Okay, yes, now I can see the question. Yeah, there was not a singular. I've tried to emphasize the heterogeneity of thought around anarchism. One of the chapters that might interest you is about Sholem Schwarzbard, who was the poet assassin who took vengeance against Petliura, the Ukrainian Cossack, and for the destruction, for the pogroms under Petliura. And the poet Schwarzbard goes to Paris and assassinates Petliura. There's a tremendous trial. Schwarzbard uses the trial as a kind of stage or platform to give this series of courtroom statements. He writes a 2-volume memoir, and he's interested in finding Talmudic justification for vengeance, for assassination. And so he's thinking in a mode where he's trying to claim a kind of religious political theology. He then went on a world tour, and I discuss in some detail the way that he was received. He became sort of a folk hero. There are mementos about Schwarzbard, but there was also tremendous anxiety about Schwarzbard and political violence. And I look at some of the ways that he's represented in Yiddish literature, in a play, in a short story. And those who really heralded Schwarzbard as a hero, his fame was far outside of Jewish anarchism. There was a lot of anxiety about what he had done as well as celebration of it. And I discuss a memoir that I found also in the Labadie Archive, incredible labor archive in Michigan, that was written by a man who became his bodyguard while Schwarzbard was in hiding. So you might be interested in reading that as well. And he describes his life with Schwarzbard undercover as Schwarzbard's bodyguard. And basically Schwarzbard is being sent all sorts of gifts, wheels of cheese. He's sent a Torah scroll by a Jewish community to say thank you for this act. He's sent cash, which he especially appreciated, but it does go into some of the ways in which Schwarzbard engaged with the public as a celebrity and also as a kind of a vexed figure in other ways. And I also talk about his relationship with Rabbi Zalkind, who was the anarchist rabbi who I mentioned previously. And their letters also reveal how they're thinking through this question of political violence, that is the specific assassination of Pet Liora, who had not been prosecuted or charged and was living freely in Paris. One of the things that Schwarzbard said, and his lawyer, Henri Torres, no relation to myself, his lawyer had been related to Dreyfus's lawyer. So they saw the trial of Schwarzbard as a way of relitigating the legacy of Dreyfus in France as well. So there were multiple ways in which they're negotiating this question of what to do with Pet Liora, what to do with this war criminal. Would it be justified, considering that he had never been charged?
We're very close to needing to close the Zoom. So I want to actually combine the last two questions because I think they're asking kind of in a similar direction. Monse asks, this is the last question, about examples of stateless ethnic anarchist collaborations in the US and how they supported each other's print culture and activism. I'm thinking of translations, citations, promoting newspapers and events, fundraising for needs and refugees. And I just want to mention this question that Marissa Buxbaum had also asked about anarchist publications in Rotwelsch, which isn't, of course, in Yiddish, but borrowed considerably from Yiddish and Hebrew. So perhaps this very specific language question might be folded into the question about examples from the US, ways that different anarchists from ethnic groups supported one another.
Great, thank you. So there are ways in which the proximity or mutual intelligibility, or sometimes only one-way intelligibility of German and Yiddish allowed there to be a syncretic emergence of Yiddish and non-Jewish German anarchist culture. Tom Goyens writes about this. We can think about also how linguistic proximity of Spanish and Ladino allowed there to be a Sephardic and Chicano and Puerto Rican labor movement, which Devin Nahr is doing very exciting work thinking about Spanish and Ladino worker cultures. So yes, what intimacies are made by linguistic families? There are accounts of, people such as Johann Most or Malatesta giving talks on stage at strikes in Paterson and in New York, and Yiddish anarchists going. And even when they couldn't understand what was being said, and with Louise Michel as well, with her speaking in French, there's an appreciation for the presence of the person. And interesting accounts of people, tens of thousands going to hear, say, an Italian anarchist speak. And what they were saying wasn't translated, but there was something about this idea of the anarchist presence or the encounter. And Goldman talks about meeting Louise Michel, who was a communard leader, led the uprising in the Paris Commune. She was deported to New Caledonia, learned the Kanak language, etc. Very interesting language politics there with French and indigenous languages. And Goldman talks about meeting her and kind of putting her head on her lap or her shoulder, and they just have this shared presence even without language. So there's a lot that could be said on a technical level about linguistics and the kind of simpatico emergence, but there was also attention to just presence and being in the presence of somebody who didn't speak the same language. And they would turn out just to see someone and try to build comradeship even without translation as well. So language does a lot, but there was something else as well that they were invested in, a mode of being together even without translation.
Anna, thank you so much for this really lucid and wonderful presentation. Highly, highly recommended. The book, you can now purchase it. It is here in the flesh. And I really loved it. Thank you for presenting for all of us.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you all for joining us. I will put a link in the chat to rewatch this program and share it. I'll leave the Zoom room open for an extra minute or so, so that way you can get any links in the chat.
There's also, if you want to, so many of the copies have already sold out from, I think, Powell's and Indie Books and everything, but you can still order the book with a discount of 30% from the website of Yale Books itself. And I will put the code, if you like, in there.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, not from Amazon, but I'll give you the discount code if you'd like. Thank you. You can still order it from the press, but the other indie bookstores are mostly sold out right now.
And the code would go directly into the Yale University Press website.
Okay, it's AETYL0224. And that's the 30% off for the yalebooks.yale.edu website.
All right, and then here's the link. Whoop, I messed up that link. The link to purchase the book from Yale. Put it in the chat right now, so that way we can all have it. Perfect. All right, well, thank you both, Anna and Amelia. This was absolutely wonderful. I especially love seeing any type of material culture. So it's thank you for bringing that into the book talk today as well. And I'll keep the Zoom open for another minute or so that way anyone can get links they would like in the chat. And we hope you will join us for our next program. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Take care, Anna. Nice to see you.
So much.
Everyone here.